Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to a special pre-show discussion ahead of tonight's Nova episode, Revolutionary War Weapons. I'm Dominic Floreno. I'm a digital production assistant here at Nova, and I'm super excited to be joined by historic firearms researcher Joel Bohy. Tonight's episode is a deep dive into the innovation and impact of the weapons that shaped the revolution, which is super exciting since we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the start of the war. So, Joel and I are going to set the stage for what you're about to see. We'll talk about some special weapons from Joel's personal collection. And after that, we'll do a couple trivia questions and send that over and, send you over to the premiere to watch afterwards. So, we're super excited to get started here. And I'm very eager. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Joel, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience? Tell them a little bit
Sure.
about your work and how you
Yeah.
involved in the show.
My name is Joel Bohy, as you said. I am an appraiser of historic arms and military at Blackstone Valley Auctions. Also an appraiser of historic arms and material culture for Antiques Roadshow. So I get to play with cool historical stuff all the time.
Awesome.
I also do a lot of research. I've been researching April 19th, 1775, the start of the Revolution, since I was a little kid. And as I've grown older, I got hooked up with some friends through some archaeology work, and we began doing a lot of live fire studies, studying the arms that were used and the ballistics of the guns, so that we can better understand the history as well as the archaeology.
Awesome. Do you want to talk a little bit about the specific types of things you did for this show in particular, some of the live fire demos and things like that?
Yeah, so for this show, we were lucky to have Fort Ticonderoga host us for the live fire for the muskets, rifle, and artillery. It was very gracious of them to allow us to go up there and do this. But what I had a part in was we fired smoothbore musket, and we fired a flintlock rifle to emulate the Kentucky style long rifle. And then we also fired a modern rifle to kind of compare some of the ballistics so that people could understand them better.
Great. So since we're on a pretty short timeline here, we only have half an hour to, talk and do some trivia. So I just want to get right into it immediately. So for everybody watching, Joel has a bit of a personal collection of antique weapons from that are extremely relevant to today's episode. Joel, you want to take out the British pattern 1756 Longland musket that you have?
Yeah, sure. So I collect different types of firearms, antique and original, but I also collect contemporary arms that are custom built that we can use for shooting. So they're safe. We know that they're made, and we know that we're not going to have an issue with them. So the first one, which we talked about, and we this is the one we used in the show, is the British pattern 1756 Longland. It's basically we used it to emulate the standard British arm of the American Revolution. There were two basic guns, other than sergeants and officers who had a different type of gun, but the enlisted men carried either the pattern 1756 Longland or the pattern 1769 Shortland. And the only major difference, there's some cosmetic differences, but is the length of the barrel. The length of the barrel on the pattern 56 is 46 inches, and the length of the barrel on the pattern 1769 is 42 inches. But we use this one to basically talk about the smooth bores themselves. So while it's a British musket, we used it to kind of emulate both sides for what we could do. Because again, we only had so much time to do this. I wish we could have done multiple episodes on just the small arms, but there was a lot to squeeze into this episode.
Yeah, so that word smoothbore is something that's going to come up a lot in tonight's episode. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so the military arms of the day, up through into the mid 19th century, for the most part, are smooth bore. There's no rifling in the bore of the gun. So they were loaded with a ball that had windage, what is called windage, and that means that the ball is smaller than the bore, because using the powder of the time period, multiple charges, you could jam a ball into the bore and not be able to shoot your gun if you didn't have that windage. So it was very important. So That's what the smoothbore is. A rifle, you have obviously rifled bore and a patched, tight-fitting ball, so you get that accuracy out of it. But with the smoothbores, which I'm more partial to, you don't have that, and it's not going to be as accurate. However, you can load the gun quicker.
Yeah, so this weapon was extremely like common at this time for the British soldiers. What made it so like popular? Why was everyone using this particular style?
Well, for the British Army, there's a myth that, you see it in documentaries all the time that both sides were shooting the exact same gun, and that's not true. While there were a few King's Arms, or we're going to use the generic term Brown Besses, um, in the American or provincial army, for the most part, the British Army used this all the time from the early 18th century into the mid 19th century or just before. So it's kind of a standardized arm. It's also pretty beefy. It's made for a soldier to handle. It's strong. It's not as apt to breaking as some of the other arms.
So that nickname that you just dropped, I gotta ask. I know we've talked before about how it's a little bit of a mystery, perhaps, or maybe lost to history, but that nickname of Brown Bess for this particular style of musket, where does that come from?
So there's all sorts of, yeah, you're right. There's all sorts of myths about it. And I would refer everybody, if you have an interest in really getting a deep dive into the term brown bess, if you do an internet search for Trusty Bess by Jonathan Ferguson, he's the curator of arms at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, England. And he did a 20 some odd page paper on just why it's called the brown bess. So I would suggest, if you want to know, do the internet search, because there's everything you ever wanted to know and then some in that paper.
Gotcha. Um, just to show can you show our audience it again? I'd love to
Yeah.
see it one more time here. Um,
Yeah. And I'll try to run down it. It's hard seated with and I've got a
wow.
bum
It's
leg right
beautiful.
now, but you can kind of get an idea of, the form of the gun, walnut stock, really heavy duty, nicely made, all individually made too. That's the other thing that people don't realize is these guns at the time, the barrels were made from flat stock and welded, so they're not all exactly the same size. So you hear people talk about the fact that they're all a .75 caliber bore, and they're not. We've done a study of 75 in great condition originals in museums and private collections, and they have a fairly wide range in the actual bore of the guns, but they're great, strong arms for soldiers' use.
So does that individual manufacturing process for each gun have other impacts other than the size of the bore kind of being different for some of them or slightly off in either direction? Did it have other
Well,
impacts on it?
it does if you're talking about a uniformity of parts. Each gun, each piece is hand fitted. So there's no interchangeability, which doesn't come along until the 19th century. So, if you have a problem with your gun and you need to replace a part, it's going to take some fitting. Where later on in the 19th century, we're working on interchangeability so you can take a part from one and put it in the other, and there's no fitting necessary.
Gotcha. Awesome. So let's go to maybe perhaps most popular gun of the night or the most important for us Americans here. Um, the provincial fowling piece.
Yeah, so
So
the
yeah, you want to
provincial
talk about this?
yeah. The provincial fowling piece is one of my personal favorites, although the pattern 56 is my favorite British musket. The civilian fowling piece was very common here, used for hunting. And they would also sometimes adapt them for military use by cutting the stock back to fit a bayonet. Because again, every male inhabitant from 16 to 60 had to do their militia service. So you had to have a firearm. If you didn't, you could get one on loan from your town or from the service if you went into the provincial army. But for the most part, a lot of the people that hunted and did fowling or shot a deer used this type of a gun. And through research of extant originals in museums, archaeology, and documents, we've proven that this is probably the most common type of gun that was carried. This particular one, again, is one of my, I've got a couple of these. This particular one is one of my favorites. It was custom built for me. It's not as beefy and thick as the British musket, so it's more prone to breakage. But it's just absolutely beautiful. brass engraved fittings, long, thin, small bore barrel. It's a smaller bore than the British musket. 55-inch barrel instead of a 46. So this one's long. And if you look at the end, if you can see it, this one I had adapted to fit a bayonet for militia use. Um, but this has a cherry stock, a locally made cherry stock. And again, it was made for shooting fowl or deer or, not necessarily for military use.
Yeah, so a lot is it's often talked about how these guns were so popular and widespread because, like you said, the men at the time had to be ready with their weapons to join the militias, and the weapon was so widespread for hunting purposes. Did it have any like actual technical advantages? Was there something useful about using it, or was it purely just for efficiency's sake? The people have them, so let's use them.
That's a good question. So, in some of our live fire studies that we've done, we weren't necessarily shooting for accuracy. We had a targeting point that we're shooting at, but we fired numerous smoothbore weapons at the targets. And one of the ones that continued to have the most accuracy every time was the fowling piece with that smaller bore and a long barrel. That 55-inch barrel really made a difference as far as hitting a target at 100 yards. Whereas the British musket and some of the other muskets that we used, the ball would stray a bit, and it can depend on the shooter too. There's a lot of variables, but that gun seemed to be a lot more accurate. Now, did that have an effect on April 19th? Maybe a little bit, but you got to remember too that when we're shooting this stuff live, we're not under fire. So we're not being shot at. So when they're in combat, it's going to be a lot different than the kind of how we set up at the range and collect the data. So, but again, I mentioned the British Brown Bess, the Pattern 56 is really beefy stock, and these guns are prone to breakage. And you can see it in some of the originals that exist. They're very crudely repaired sometimes. So they were more prone to breakage, even if they were being used for hunting. But in military use, fairly accurate, but just not meant for that service.
Yeah, something that is just so interesting to me about the fouling piece is it really kind of shows like the ingenuity and the craftiness of the colonists that were fighting at the time. For example, like one thing that I thought was interesting from an article that I was reading that you sent me was the special kinds of ammo that were used, like buck and ball and stuff, that were kind of made to turn them from hunting weapons into military weapons. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, you would use for whatever you're hunting, you could use different types of shot. So some would use a stacked cartridge or stacked buckshot or swan shot with no round ball, depending on what you're shooting, if you're shooting at fowl. But for military use, more than likely, especially on April 19th, they would be using a round ball so they could hit their target. Now, I have found some documents that mention a few guys that were carrying buckshot. But there also is a military cartridge called Buck and Ball, where you would have a round ball with 3 buckshot on top of it. So that when you loaded your paper cartridge, you bite your cartridge, which you'll see in the episode. You pour some in the pan of the lock to make it fire when the flint strikes, and then you pour the rest down the barrel and you put that paper cartridge with the ball or the buck and ball down and ram it home, and then you can fire basically the round shot and buckshot at your enemy.
Awesome. Um, so this third weapon is really interesting to me that you have this French model, the 1728 musket. Do you want to show our audience it first before I ask some questions about it? I'm
Yeah.
super interested in this one.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the French 1728. This would have been in use during the French and Indian War, but if you notice, it has bands that hold the barrel on. So barrel removal is going to be a lot easier than the other 2 guns that I just showed with pin barrels.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's really nice. So this is incredible to me. Was made in France, or is it like a French style that was made in America often, or were these guns made in France and shipped over?
So these guns would have been made in France. There were some that were made in Liège for use of the militia in Canada during the French and Indian War. But for the most part, you can say they're French made. These would have been shipped over, used during the French and Indian War, and a lot of them were captured. So you can look in the Boston newspapers, and you can see tons of these guns for sale all over the place, not just Boston, but they were a surplus gun. They had seen a little bit of use, but they still functioned properly. So you could get one with a bayonet, and they were reasonably priced. So you could use one for your militia service, or you could hunt with it. But the key piece, which I kind of mentioned with that gun, is the fact that it's also a beautiful gun. I don't like the later French guns that much personally, but this one, being able to, for a soldier to be able to take those bands off and unscrew one screw, and you can take the barrel off for cleaning, makes
Hmm.
it a lot easier for a soldier. It's also a lighter gun than the British pattern 56. So it's a little more nimble, easy to move around, a little smaller bore. But it was a pretty popular gun, and we see instances of these being used in 1775 by militia and minute companies.
Is there any other like noticeable differences in either quality or like actual tactical advantages to the British Brown Bess? Um, any other major differences there?
Well, the two important ones for both of those guns is they accept a bayonet.
Hmm.
Because when you get up close to an enemy, if you can't put on a bayonet, you're in trouble.
Hmm.
So they both accept a bayonet. The British musket is going to be heavier. It's a little harder to carry than the French musket is because of the weight difference.
And that big stock at the
Um,
back.
yeah, it's a really beefy stock. But the other thing is it's also a bigger bore, and it uses a little more powder to push that ball out.
Hmm.
So are there great advantages to either? I mean, I don't know. I think I like all of them. These are my three favorites for different reasons. For different reasons, and like any tool, they all have their uses. When we do archaeology, we have certain equipment that will do one job, but maybe not the other. So that these are kind of the same way. And we'll see that in the episode when we talk about the rifle.
Absolutely. Speaking of the rifle, I gotta ask. So, as members of the audience might have noticed, the three guns we have here today to talk about are all muskets. Do you want to talk a little bit about, like, maybe to the kind of myth or legend, I guess, about the over importance of the rifle and how that's kind of been overstated over the course of history, and really maybe the primary importance of the musket?
Well, one of the bigger myths, and I see this all the time. I've seen it in some of the comments that I happen to scan through when I was looking at the show on social media. Is people make comments that, oh, it was because of the rifle at Lexington and Concord that we won the battle, or Bunker Hill. That's not the case. New England was not a big rifle area. There were a few around, but for the most part, the people in New England like smoothbore guns. But then you have some of the folks from Virginia, Pennsylvania, that area, who were brought up with the rifle, and they knew it was a very accurate gun. And so those folks come up to the siege of Boston with some of the rifles, and some of the New Englanders don't know what to think about them. Because they're seeing these guys hit a target at a great range, which they can do. Um, but they also have their downfalls. And again, that's something that'll come up in the episode.
Yeah, just to kind of wrap up this part of the discussion before we jump into a little bit of trivia, I'm super interested just to ask, um, from doing this work and this research into ballistics and looking at bullet struck artifacts and stuff like that, can you speak to a little bit about how this helps us fill in our knowledge gaps of the history of the American Revolution?
Yeah. So growing up, I grew up in Concord, right off the battlefield. So I spent most of my youth and adult life out there, walking around the battlefield and reading primary accounts. But I think when we study the arms, how they function, archaeology, experimental archaeology, doing live fire studying, we can learn a lot more about maybe the way things happen the way they did. The bullet strikes, that gave us more of a human side to it. When you see the battle damage, we've researched everything from every bullet strike from Concord back through to what's Menotomy, the Cambridge Village of Menotomy, which is now Arlington, Mass. And it really shows you how during the day the ferocity of the battle grew and grew and grew. And it really does bring that human element into it, which is one thing we can't forget when we talk about this stuff. It's all well and good to be patriotic and talk about, the battle and the leaders and all this stuff. But, that human element, I think, is really important to better understanding the people of the day as well as what happened.
Yeah, just to give us a more well-rounded view of the events, it's a key aspect that can't be left out. It's super important.
Yeah. No, it is super important. And, I hope by some of the research we've been doing and sharing and by this episode, that we can bring a little bit of that out. Again, I wish we had, 3 episodes to talk about small arms,
Absolutely.
but
A whole
but
series.
we were able to jam a lot into a short amount of time. So, and I hope that's what some of the people get from some of this after they've seen it.
Absolutely. And I really think they will. This is a great episode for everybody that's joining this live stream. It's going to be a blast to watch. So I think we're ready to hop into a little bit of trivia here. Joel, I'll read the questions. We'll give the audience a couple seconds to answer them in the chat, and then we'll briefly discuss the answers to them and their importance. So question one for everybody here in the audience. What was the primary firearm used by soldiers during the Revolutionary War? Primary firearm. Can all drop your questions in the chat. Give you guys a couple seconds here to answer. The answer, the musket, primary weapon. Often the Brown Bess musket was the primary firearm used by soldiers on both sides. This is something we were just talking about, Joel, the importance of the musket, especially in the New England battles. They were used by the militia and the Minutemen, who took the weapons that they just had for hunting or were given them. And also super popular, like the British model and leftover muskets from the French and Indian War that kind of made their way throughout the colonies. Go to question two, please. So question two here, what type of weapon did many indigenous people use in battle during the Revolutionary War, often in close combat? This was not in our discussion from Joel, but it's just a little teaser of something that's going to come up a lot in the episode. Give you all a second here to drop your answers for a little bit. This is a great segment from the show. I was actually just cutting an excerpt from this for social. So a really cool part of the documentary. The answer, many indigenous people used a small axe-like weapon known as a tomahawk. Early tomahawks were made of stone and later evolved into steel and iron versions. I think this is such a cool part of the episode because, something you just mentioned, Joel, about how the muskets, the advantage that they had, the British and the French ones, was that you could attach a bayonet, and that aspect of the close quarters combat and needing to not just have a weapon that could shoot well, but to have something that you could use when the enemy got up close to you. Can you speak to a little bit about that and the importance of like the
Yeah.
bayonet and the tomahawk?
So we also used tomahawks. The British Light Infantry, who marched to Concord on April 19th, carried one. In Massachusetts, as part of the militia laws, if you couldn't fit a bayonet to your gun, you had to have a cutting sword or a tomahawk. And there are towns that were issuing out tomahawks to some of their men prior to April 19th or after April 19th when they received the alarm in
Mm,
March to the siege of Boston. So the tomahawk was an important gun for indigenous folks, but also the musket was too. So
absolutely. Go to question three here. It's true or false one. This is a little bit of shake it up. One person is able to operate a 4-pounder cannon. True or false? This is also something that's going to come up in the episode. A great segment. I love this part. All the explosions and stuff that you'll see here in this part of the documentary are really awesome, and I think are maybe some of the most cinematic parts of the episode. I'll give you all just a second here to drop your answers in chat. The answer is false. Revolutionary War cannons required multiple people to load, aim, fire the cannon effectively. They were huge, right, Joel?
well, they had all different sizes, yeah. But I have to tell you from watching them film that section because I was the best place behind the gun when they were filming that, and it was earth shaking. It was a lot of fun to watch.
Amazing. That's great. Were they really like that powerful when you were firing them in person? Like, what was it like?
Oh, you
Because
could
even on
feel
camera,
it go.
it's
Oh,
intense.
it went right through your body every shot. And those guys are masters of it up at Ticonderoga. They really did a great job.
Yeah, they're really good. Let's go to the last question here. One more true or false. The smoothbore musket was more accurate than the long rifle. Guys, if you've been watching the pre-show, you should know this answer. Joel and I talked about it for quite a little bit here with the reference to the muskets that Joel brought. And I'll get you, wait, I'll give you all just a second just to make sure you're submitting the right answer, everybody in chat. And the answer, of course, is false. The spiral grooves, known as rifling inside the barrel, and the two sights of the long rifle made it a much more accurate weapon. The rifle was far more accurate than the muskets were. But they both had their advantages, as we talked about, right, Joel?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
wasn't just that one was just better or that the other one was completely useless. Like they were still very important.
They all had a job, you know.
Yeah.
They all had a job, specific jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as like a final wrap up question here for you, you've written a lot about revolutionary weapons. Um, what do you think is one of like the most misunderstood aspects of this era's warfare? Like, what's something that if somebody comes up to you and they're like, and you want to tell them something just to clarify their worldview and their information base, like, what's your go-to kind of a tidbit to drop on them?
I think it's something I mentioned earlier, and it pops up constantly. Is the rifles being in New England and everybody carrying one, and it's just not the case. And literally, it's all the time. I get asked that question every presentation I give. Um, I see it all over the place, and it's just even historians writing books about it. They just don't understand the weaponry. So I think that's one of the takes. I hope that people learn from this is one, New Englanders were not really fond of rifles at that time. They were big smoothbore folks, and two, that all of these guns have their job.
Yeah, every gun was important. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for checking out the pre-show. This was a great discussion. I had a lot of fun talking about weapons and history with you. If you guys want to learn more about Joel's work, you can check out his new book, Bullet Strikes from the First Day of the American Revolution, which he co-wrote with Doug Scott. It's available for purchase from Mowbray Publishing, or you can buy it on Amazon. And as a reminder for everyone, you can just stay on this live stream. You'll be automatically sent over to the premiere of the new episode in the next couple minutes. Thanks again for hanging out with us, Joel. I really appreciate this. This was a great
Oh,
discussion. It
anytime.
flew by. I can't believe it was already
I know.
30
It
minutes.
was a lot of fun.
It went like just like that. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We just have a couple minutes here as we wait for the premiere of the episode to start. Yeah, thank you so much.